The late afternoon sun hung low over the Wyoming territory, casting long shadows across the parched earth where sparse grass grew in brittle clumps between weathered stones. A chill wind swept down from the distant mountains, carrying with it the promise of an early spring storm and the scent of sage and dust. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking a dry creek bed or the dark silhouette of mesa rising from the plains like ancient sentinels. Jasper Calloway rode his bay gelding at an easy pace along the well-worn trail that led from the settlement of Cedar Flats back to his modest ranch. The horse's hooves struck a steady rhythm against the packed earth, and leather creaked softly with each movement. Jasper sat straight in the saddle, his weathered hands loose on the reins. Pale blue eyes scanning the horizon with the unconscious vigilance of a man who had learned that survival in this country demanded constant awareness. At 34, Jasper bore the marks of 15 years on the frontier. His face was lean and sun-darkened, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting against the endless glare of prairie sky. Dark brown hair showed traces of premature gray at the temples, and his hands were scarred from rope burns and barbed wire. He wore simple clothes, wool trousers, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest, all practical garments chosen for durability rather than appearance. A Colt revolver rested in the holster at his hip, its grip worn smooth from years of use. The ranch he called home lay another hour's ride ahead, a small spread with perhaps 200 head of cattle scattered across several thousand acres of grazing land. It was not much by the standards of the big outfits, but it was his, earned through back-breaking work and careful saving. Most days, the solitude suited him fine. He had grown accustomed to the silence, to the company of his horses and cattle, to evenings spent alone by the fire with only the wind for conversation. Today had been market day in Cedar Flats, and Jasper's saddlebags carried supplies, coffee, flour, ammunition, and a few yards of blue calico he had purchased on impulse, thinking it might make good curtains for the cabin's single window. The transaction had been conducted in typical frontier fashion, few words, firm handshakes, and cash on the barrelhead. He had avoided the saloon, as was his custom, and spoken to no one beyond what business required. The trail curved around a rocky outcropping, and Jasper's attention was caught by something that made him pull up short. There, clearly visible in the fine dust of the path, was a splash of dark red that could only be blood. It was fresh, still glistening wetly in the slanted light, and far too much to have come from a rabbit or prairie dog. The stain was roughly the size of a man's hand, with smaller drops leading away from the main trail toward a tangle of brush and weathered boulders. Jasper dismounted and knelt beside the blood, studying it with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of violence. The color and consistency told him it was human, and the amount suggested a serious wound. He looked around carefully, noting the absence of other travelers on the normally busy trail. No hoofprints or boot marks were visible in the immediate area, which struck him as odd. Following the crimson trail, Jasper led his horse off the main path and into the rough country beyond. The blood drops appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes on stones, sometimes soaked into patches of sandy soil. Whoever had left this trail was moving slowly, probably struggling with each step. The spacing of the drops suggested someone on foot, staggering rather than walking steadily. The wind picked up, stirring the branches of stunted pines and sending a few early leaves skittering across the ground. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously, and Jasper glanced up to see dark clouds building over the western peaks. A storm was coming, and if he intended to follow this trail, he would need to do so quickly before the weather washed away all traces. The blood trail led deeper into the broken country, winding between jumbled rocks and through stands of scrub oak that caught at his clothing. Jasper's horse snorted nervously, perhaps catching the scent of blood or sensing his rider's tension. The terrain grew more difficult, forcing him to pick his way carefully over loose stones that could easily lame a horse. After perhaps half a mile, the trail led to a grove of ancient cottonwoods that had somehow found enough water to grow to impressive size. Their massive trunks, some 4 feet across, created a natural shelter from the wind. It was here that Jasper discovered the source of the blood trail. Near the center of the grove stood the hollow remains of what had once been the largest cottonwood. Lightning or disease had killed the tree years ago, and weather had carved out its center, leaving a natural cavity large enough for a person to hide within. The blood trail ended at the base of this natural shelter. Jasper approached cautiously, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the branches overhead and the distant rumble of thunder. As he drew nearer to the hollow tree, he became aware of another sound, the rapid, shallow breathing of someone trying very hard to remain quiet. "Hello?" he called softly, not wanting to startle whoever might be hiding within. "I followed your trail from the road. You're hurt, and there's a storm coming." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, so quietly he almost missed it beneath the sound of the wind, came a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "Please, if you tell anyone you found me here, they'll kill my daughter." The words hit Jasper like a physical blow. The desperation in that whispered plea, the terror that lay beneath it, spoke of dangers far worse than anything the wilderness might offer. He had heard similar pleas before in the war, from civilians caught between armies. It was the voice of someone who had already lost everything except the one thing that mattered most. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm not here to hurt you or turn you over to anyone, but you're bleeding, and this storm's going to be a bad one. Let me help you." Another silence, longer this time. Then came the sound of movement from within the hollow tree, careful, painful movement, as if every motion required tremendous effort. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows within. The woman who crawled out of the hollow tree was young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress, once a respectable brown wool, was torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her face was pale with exhaustion and loss of blood, but her green eyes burned with a fierce protective instinct as she clutched a small bundle against her chest. The bundle was a baby, Jasper realized with a start, an infant perhaps only a few weeks old, wrapped in what had once been a white blanket but was now stained with travel and fear. The child was mercifully quiet, though whether from exhaustion or illness, he could not tell. The woman's left arm hung awkwardly at her side, and Jasper could see where blood had soaked through her sleeve and down her dress. She had been shot, he realized, or stabbed, some wound that continued to seep despite her attempts to bind it. Her boots were worn through in places, and her stockings were torn from walking over rough ground. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Green eyes that spoke of intelligence and determination, but also of fear so profound it seemed to emanate from her very soul. This was a woman who had been pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance, yet somehow found the strength to keep moving, to keep protecting the precious burden she carried. "Ma'am," Jasper said again, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "My name is Jasper Calloway. I have a cabin about an hour's ride from here. You and your baby need shelter and medical attention. I give you my word that whatever brought you here, whoever you're running from, I won't turn you over to them." The woman studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. Finally, she nodded almost imperceptibly. "My name is Clara," she whispered. "And if you're lying to me, we're all dead." Getting Clara out of the hollow tree proved more difficult than Jasper had anticipated. Her injured arm made movement painful, and she was weaker than she had initially appeared. Each time she tried to stand, her legs trembled with exhaustion, and the effort caused fresh blood to seep through the makeshift bandage she had fashioned from torn petticoat fabric. Jasper moved slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. He had seen enough frightened animals to know that sudden movements or loud sounds could send them bolting, and this woman had the same wild, desperate look in her eyes. Whatever had driven her to hide in that tree trunk with a newborn baby had left her balanced on the knife's edge of complete panic. "Easy now," he murmured, reaching out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. "Take your time. The baby, is she hurt?" Clara's grip tightened protectively around the small bundle. "No," she whispered. She's so tired. We've been walking for 3 days." 3 days. Jasper felt a cold anger settle in his chest at the thought of this woman and infant traveling on foot across the harsh Wyoming landscape. But he kept his expression neutral. Questions could wait. Right now. The approaching storm took precedence over everything else. The first fat raindrops were already beginning to fall, and the wind had picked up considerably. In the distance, lightning flickered against the darkening sky, followed by the low rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the full fury of the storm hit. "Ma'am, Clara, I need to get you up on my horse," Jasper said, glancing at the increasingly ominous sky. "It's going to be a hard ride, but we need to reach shelter before this storm breaks." Clara nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes at the prospect of being so exposed, so vulnerable. Her gaze kept darting back toward the trail they had left, as if she expected to see riders in pursuit at any moment. Jasper's bay gelding, Buck, was a steady animal with a calm temperament, but even he seemed nervous about the approaching weather. The horse stamped and snorted as Jasper approached with Clara, no doubt picking up on the scent of blood and the tension that radiated from both humans. "He's gentle," Jasper assured her, running a calming hand along Buck's neck. "Been with me for 8 years. He'll carry you safe." With infinite care, Jasper helped Clara mount the horse, supporting her injured arm and ensuring the baby remained secure in her grasp. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as the movement jarred her wound, but she made no complaint. Once she was settled in the saddle, Jasper swung up behind her, careful not to crowd her or make her feel trapped. The ride back to his cabin was a journey through growing darkness and increasing wind. Clara sat rigid in front of him, her body tense with pain and fear. Every few minutes, she would turn her head to look back over her shoulder, scanning the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. Each time she did, Jasper felt her trembling increase. "How far?" she asked once, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Another half hour," he replied, urging Buck to a faster pace as the first serious raindrops began to fall. "Maybe less." The baby stirred occasionally in Clara's arms, making small sounds that were almost lost in the growing storm. Clara would murmur to the child in tones so soft Jasper could not make out the words. But the tenderness in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever else this woman might be, fugitive, victim, or something else entirely, she was clearly a devoted mother. As they rode, Jasper found himself studying the woman in front of him. Her posture spoke of education and breeding. She sat a horse well despite her injuries, and her speech carried the inflections of someone who had received proper schooling. This was not some frontier woman born to hardship, but someone who had known a different life before whatever circumstances had driven her to hide in a hollow tree with her infant daughter. The storm struck just as Jasper's cabin came into view. What had been steady rainfall suddenly became a downpour, driven horizontal by winds that howled across the open prairie. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white fire, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to crack the very air around them. Buck snorted and danced sideways, but held his course toward the small building that represented safety and warmth. Jasper's cabin sat in a sheltered depression between two low hills, positioned to take advantage of a year-round spring that bubbled up from an underground source. It was a modest structure, built of pine logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney that was already visible against the storm-dark sky. 2 rooms comprised the entire dwelling, a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, and a smaller bedroom barely large enough for a bed and dresser. "Hey there," Jasper called over the storm's roar, pointing toward the cabin. "Almost home." The word slipped out before he could stop it, and he felt Clara stiffen in front of him. Home. As if she belonged there. As if this were anything more than temporary shelter for a stranger in desperate need. But there was something about this woman, about the protective way she held her child and the quiet dignity with which she bore her pain, that had already begun to stir feelings in him that he had thought long buried. They reached the cabin just as the full fury of the storm unleashed itself upon the prairie. Jasper helped Clara down from the horse, supporting her weight as her legs nearly buckled beneath her. The baby was crying now, a thin wail that spoke of hunger and discomfort, and Clara's face was tight with worry and exhaustion. "Get inside," Jasper shouted over the wind. "I'll see to Buck and be right in." Clara stumbled toward the cabin door, clutching her daughter against her chest. Jasper watched until she was safely inside before leading Buck to the small barn that stood behind the house. The structure was simple but sturdy, with 3 stalls and a hayloft that stayed reasonably dry even in the worst weather. As he unsaddled Buck and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of straw, Jasper's mind raced with questions. Who was chasing Clara? What had she done? Or what had been done to her? That would drive someone to threaten a mother and infant? And why had she chosen to trust him, a complete stranger, with their lives? The cabin felt different when he stepped back inside, as if the mere presence of another person, especially a woman and child, had somehow transformed the space. Clara sat huddled near the cold fireplace, still clutching her baby, her wet dress clinging to her thin frame. She looked around the room with the quick, assessing glances of someone who had learned to catalog exits and potential weapons wherever she went. The main room was spartanly furnished but clean and well-maintained. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, while a simple kitchen area lined one wall. Shelves held basic supplies, canned goods, coffee, flour, and ammunition. A rifle hung on pegs above the fireplace, and Jasper's few books were stacked neatly on a small side table. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone and had little use for decoration or comfort beyond the essential. "Let me get a fire started," Jasper said, moving to the hearth where split logs lay ready for lighting. "Get some warmth in here." Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and beginning to drive the chill from the air. Clara had not moved from her position near the fireplace, but Jasper could see some of the tension leave her shoulders as the warmth began to penetrate her wet clothing. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to the kitchen area. "I've got some stew from yesterday and coffee." Clara shook her head, though he could see the lie in her hollow cheeks and the way her eyes lingered on the pot he had indicated. "The baby," she said instead. "She needs—" "I haven't been able to." She trailed off, color rising in her pale cheeks. Jasper understood immediately. A nursing mother needed food and water to produce milk, and Clara had clearly been surviving on very little for days. Without another word, He ladled stew into a bowl and poured a cup of coffee, setting both on the table within easy reach. Then he moved to the far side of the room, settling into his chair with his back turned to give her privacy. "Eat," he said simply. "You can't care for her if you don't care for yourself." For a long moment, Clara remained motionless. Then, as if some internal dam had burst, she moved to the table and began eating with the desperate hunger of someone who had been denying her body's needs for far too long. The stew disappeared quickly, followed by a second bowl, and then a third. The coffee cup was refilled twice. Throughout the meal, she kept glancing toward the door, her entire body tense with listening. Every crack of thunder made her start, and when the wind rattled the cabin's windows, her hand would move instinctively toward the baby as if to shield her from unseen threats. "Hey, how long since you've slept?" Jasper asked when she finally pushed the empty bowl away. I don't remember," Clara admitted. "Every time I tried to rest, I thought I heard horses, voices." The exhaustion in her voice was profound, and Jasper could see that she was fighting to stay conscious. The warmth of the fire, the food in her stomach, and the temporary sense of safety were all conspiring to overwhelm her body's desperate need for rest. "You can take the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire and I'll keep watch." "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Jasper's voice was firm but gentle. "Ma'am, whatever brought you here, whoever's chasing you, they won't find you tonight. Not in this storm. You need rest, and that baby needs her mother strong." Clara looked toward the bedroom door, then back at Jasper. In her eyes, he could see the war between desperate need and ingrained caution. She wanted to trust him, but something had taught her that trust was a luxury she could not afford. As if sensing her mother's internal struggle, the baby began to fuss again, her small cries growing stronger and more insistent. Clara's resolve crumbled in the face of her daughter's needs. "Thank you," she whispered, rising unsteadily from the table. Thank you." She disappeared into the bedroom, and Jasper heard the soft sounds of her settling the baby. Soon, the infant's cries faded to contented silence, and then there was only the storm raging outside and the comforting crackle of the fire. But sleep did not come easily to Jasper that night. He sat in his chair with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind and rain while his mind turned over everything he had observed about his unexpected guests. The quality of Clara's speech, the way she carried herself despite her exhaustion, the obvious care that had gone into the baby's clothing despite their current bedraggled state, all of it suggested people of some standing who had fallen on desperate circumstances. And then there were those words she had spoken in the hollow tree. "They'll kill my daughter if you tell." Not, "They'll hurt us" or "They'll take us back," but specifically that they would kill the child. What kind of people threatened an infant? What kind of situation had Clara found herself in that made hiding in the wilderness with a newborn seem like the safer option? Near midnight, the storm began to abate, though rain continued to patter steadily against the windows. It was then that Jasper heard what he had been half expecting all evening, the distant sound of horses moving through the night. The hoofbeats were muffled by the wet ground and the continued rainfall, but they were definitely there, coming from the direction of the main trail. Jasper rose silently from his chair and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. He could see nothing in the storm-washed night, but the sound of horses continued to drift across the prairie. They seemed to be moving slowly, as if their riders were searching for something or someone. The hoofbeats continued for perhaps 10 minutes before fading away toward the south. But Jasper remained at the window long after they had disappeared, his rifle ready and his senses alert, because he knew, with the certainty that came from years of frontier living, that this was only the beginning. In the bedroom, He could hear Clara's breathing, quick and shallow even in sleep. She had heard the horses, too. Dawn came gray and cold, with wisps of fog rising from the rain-soaked prairie like the ghosts of yesterday's storm. Jasper had dozed fitfully in his chair throughout the night, jerking awake at every sound, the settling of the cabin's logs, the drip of water from the eaves, the distant call of a meadowlark greeting the reluctant sun. His rifle had never left his hands, and his ears had remained tuned to the possibility of returning hoofbeats. Clara emerged from the bedroom as the first pale light filtered through the cabin's single window. She moved quietly, careful not to wake the baby who slept peacefully in her arms. But Jasper could tell from the dark circles under her eyes that she had slept no better than he had. Her auburn hair was neatly braided now, and she had done what she could to clean and mend her torn dress. But the pallor of her skin and the careful way she held her injured arm spoke of pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "You heard them too," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him at the table. It was not a question. Jasper nodded, setting his rifle against the wall within easy reach. Around midnight, 3, maybe 4 horses, and they were searching. Clara's arms tightened around her daughter, and for a moment her composure cracked enough to reveal the terror that lurked just beneath the surface. They won't give up. He won't let them. He? The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara stared down at her sleeping child, her jaw working as if she were fighting some internal battle about how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Royce Harland, my late husband's brother." The name meant nothing to Jasper, but the way Clara spoke it, with a mixture of fear and loathing that made her entire body go rigid, told him everything he needed to know about the character of the man. He had known men like that, men who took what they wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in their way. "Your husband," Jasper said carefully. "How long has he been gone?" 6 weeks, Clara's voice caught slightly. "Pneumonia took him fast. Thomas was never strong, not since the war. He tried to be a good man, tried to provide for us, but—" She trailed off, lost in memories that brought no comfort. Jasper waited, understanding that sometimes the hardest truths came out slowly, like water from a reluctant well. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched toward the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, men were looking for the woman who sat across from him, and those men meant her harm. Thomas owed money, Clara continued finally. A lot of money. To Royce, to others. He kept borrowing, kept hoping the next venture would pay off, but it never did. When he died, Royce said the debts passed to me, said I belonged to him now, along with everything Thomas had left behind, including your daughter. The words came out harsher than Jasper had intended, but the thought of anyone claiming ownership over a child, over any human being, stirred an anger in him that he had to work to control. Clara flinched as if he had struck her, but nodded. He said she was collateral. Said if I tried to run, if I refused to honor Thomas's obligations, he would take her from me and I would never see her again. Clara's voice broke completely on the last words, and tears spilled down her cheeks. I believed him. I've seen what he's capable of. Jasper felt that cold rage settle deeper in his chest. He had encountered men like Royce Harland before, predators who used law and custom and the weakness of others to justify their cruelty. In the territories, where legal authority was often hundreds of miles away and might consisted of whoever had the most guns. Such men flourished like weeds in a neglected garden. What changed? He asked. What made you run? Clara was quiet for so long that Jasper began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. 3 nights ago, he came to the house. He was drunk, and he said he was tired of waiting. Said it was time I started earning my keep. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her injured arm. When I refused, when I tried to get away from him, he threw me against the wall. Said next time he wouldn't be so gentle. Said next time, if I fought him, he would hurt the baby to teach me proper respect. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The blood trail, the desperate flight with a newborn, the terror in Clara's eyes whenever she heard horses in the distance, all of it made horrible sense. She had not been running from debt or even from Royce's claim on her person. She had been running to protect her child from a man who would use an infant's pain to control her mother. "So you took the baby and left," Jasper said. "That same night, I packed what little I could carry, took what money I had hidden away, and we started walking. I hoped we could reach my sister in Colorado. She married a rancher there, lives near a town called Silver Creek. But it's so far, and with the baby." Clara's voice trailed off as she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "How did you get hurt?" "Yesterday morning, I thought I heard riders behind us, so I tried to hide in some rocks near Devil's Canyon. I slipped, cut my arm on the stone." She gestured toward her injured limb. "The bleeding wouldn't stop, and I was getting weak. When I saw that hollow tree, it seemed like a gift from God. Somewhere to rest, somewhere to think." Jasper nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications of what she had told him. Royce Harland was clearly a man with connections and resources, or he would not have been able to field multiple search parties in rough weather. He was also patient and methodical, the kind of predator who would keep hunting until he found his prey. "What do you know about this Royce?" Jasper asked. "What kind of man is he? What kind of backing does he have?" Clara's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "He owns half the businesses in Cedar Flats, has his fingers in everything from the bank to the saloon to the freight company. Sheriff Morrison owes him money, just like everyone else in town. The territorial marshal comes through maybe twice a year, and when he does, Royce makes sure to be on his best behavior. That explained the riders in the night, with the local law in his pocket and enough money to hire as many men as he needed. Royce could effectively operate with impunity. He could claim that Clara had stolen from him, or that she owed him money, or simply that she was his property under some twisted interpretation of her late husband's debts. In a territory where might made right and women had few protections under law, such claims would be accepted without question. "He told people I was unstable," Clara continued. "Said losing Thomas had affected my mind, that I might hurt myself or the baby. Said if anyone found us, they should bring us back to him for our own safety. Most people in town believe him. Why wouldn't they? He's respected, prosperous. I'm just a widow with debts and a reputation for being difficult." The full scope of Royce's manipulation was becoming clear. By painting Clara as mentally unstable, he had given himself legal and moral justification for hunting her down. He could claim he was acting out of concern for her welfare and that of the child. Any violence that occurred in the process of rescuing them could be explained away as necessary for their protection. "What about your sister?" Jasper asked. "Would she help you if you could reach her?" "If I could reach her, yes. Margaret always said I should have left Thomas years ago, that his gambling would be the ruin of us all. She has no love for Royce either. He tried to court her before she married her husband, and he didn't take her rejection well." Clara shifted the baby to her other arm, wincing as the movement jarred her injury. But Colorado might as well be the moon. It's 3 weeks' travel by wagon, longer on foot. And now that he knows I'm running... She did not need to finish the thought. Royce would be watching the roads, checking with every freight company and stagecoach line, bribing or threatening anyone who might help a lone woman with an infant reach the Colorado territory. He would cast his net wide and draw it tight, confident that eventually Clara would be forced to surface. Jasper stood and moved to the window, looking out across the prairie toward the main trail. The morning sun was burning off the last of the fog, revealing a landscape that looked peaceful and empty. But he knew that somewhere out there, men were searching, and it was only a matter of time before those men widened their search to include his remote cabin. "You said the law won't help," he said without turning around. "What about other people in the area? Anyone who might stand up to Royce?" "A few, maybe, but not enough to matter. He's been building his power for years, making sure that anyone who might oppose him either owes him money or has something to hide. The ones who can't be bought or blackmailed tend to find themselves with mysterious troubles. Livestock poisoned, barns burned, that sort of thing. Nothing that can be traced back to him directly. But the message is clear enough." Jasper turned back to face her, studying the determined set of her jaw despite the fear in her eyes. Clara had clearly given this considerable thought during her desperate flight across the prairie. She understood exactly what she was up against, and the knowledge had not broken her. That spoke to a strength of character that he found himself admiring. "There's something else," Clara said hesitantly. "Something I haven't told you." Jasper waited, recognizing the tone of someone about to reveal a truth that might change everything. Thomas didn't just owe Royce money. Before he died, he signed papers, a contract of some kind. I never saw it, but Royce showed it to me after the funeral. He said it gave him legal claim to everything Thomas owned, including... She swallowed hard. "Including his wife and children until the debt was satisfied." The words hit Jasper like a physical blow. Such contracts were not unheard of in the territories, where traditional law often gave way to cruder forms of justice. A man desperate enough might indeed sign away his family's freedom in exchange for one more chance to make good on his debts. Whether such a contract would hold up in a proper court was questionable. But in a place like Cedar Flats, where the local authority was already in Royce's pocket, it might as well have been carved in stone. "That's why you can't go to the law," Jasper said, understanding dawning. "Even if there was an honest sheriff, even if you could reach the territorial marshal, Royce has paperwork that gives him legal claim to you." Clara nodded miserably. "He showed me the contract. Thomas's signature was on it, along with 2 witnesses. It looked official enough. Whether it would stand up in a real court, I don't know. But by the time anyone questioned it, by then it would be too late. Royce would have what he wanted, and any subsequent legal challenges would be meaningless." The law moved slowly in the territories, and a man with enough influence could tie up legal proceedings for years while maintaining de facto control over whatever he claimed to own. Jasper moved back to his chair, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. Running was not a viable option. Clara and the baby would never make it to Colorado on foot, and any attempt to travel by conventional means would be intercepted. Hiding was equally futile. Royce had too many resources and too much patience. That left only one alternative, and it was the most dangerous one of all. "He'll come here eventually," Jasper said finally. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. His men will search every cabin, every ranch, every place where someone might hide a woman and child." "I know." Clara's voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door. I had nowhere else to go. And I thought I hoped maybe I could rest here for just one night before moving on. I never meant to involve you in this." "You didn't involve me," Jasper said quietly. "I chose to get involved the moment I decided to follow that blood trail. And now that I know what kind of man you're running from." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but Clara seemed to understand, for the first time since he had found her in the hollow tree. Clara smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her entire face. "You don't even know me. You don't owe me anything." "No," Jasper agreed, "I don't. But some things are right and some things are wrong, and a man who would threaten a baby to control her mother falls pretty clearly into the second category." Outside, a meadowlark called again, its song bright and clear in the morning air. The sound was peaceful, normal, a reminder that the world continued to turn despite the darkness that men like Royce Harlan brought into it. But Jasper knew that peace was temporary. Soon enough, that darkness would come looking for them, and when it did, he would be ready. The days that followed settled into a tense routine that felt both natural and charged with unspoken danger. Clara proved to be a capable woman despite her circumstances, helping with simple tasks around the cabin while carefully nursing her injured arm back to health. She mended Jasper's torn shirts with neat, precise stitches, prepared meals that transformed his basic supplies into something approaching civilization, and kept the baby, whom she called Little Sarah, clean and content despite their precarious situation. Jasper found himself appreciating the small changes her presence brought to his solitary existence. The cabin felt warmer somehow, filled with quiet conversations and the soft sounds of a woman caring for her child. Clara had a way of moving through the space that made it seem less like a bachelor's rough shelter and more like an actual home. But beneath this domestic tranquility lay the constant awareness that they were living on borrowed time. Every morning, Jasper rode out to check his cattle and survey the surrounding area for signs of searchers. Every evening, he returned with his rifle loaded and his senses alert. He taught Clara where he kept his spare ammunition, showed her how to bar the door from the inside, and made sure she knew the location of every weapon in the cabin. She proved an apt student, handling the lessons with a grim determination that spoke of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. On the third day, Jasper made a decision that surprised even himself. After his morning ride, instead of returning directly to the cabin, he turned Buck towards Cedar Flats. Clara needed supplies, proper bandages for her arm, fabric for the baby's diapers, and food more suited to a nursing mother than his usual fare of beans and salt pork. But more than that, he needed to take the measure of Royce Harlan, to see for himself what kind of man they were dealing with. The ride to town took him through familiar country, past the spot where he had first found Clara's blood trail. The hollow tree stood empty now, its dark interior seeming to mock the desperate hope that had once sheltered there. A meadowlark perched on one of the dead branches, singing its liquid song to the morning sky, oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded in its shadow. Cedar Flats was a typical frontier settlement, built around the intersection of two cattle trails and sustained by the business they brought. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their weathered boards and peeling paint speaking of a community that was more concerned with function than appearance. The general store, the saloon, the hotel, and the bank clustered together like sheep seeking protection from the vastness of the surrounding prairie. Jasper hitched Buck outside Morrison's general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, his boots ringing against the boards. The morning was still cool, but he could feel sweat gathering under his shirt collar, not from the temperature, but from the knowledge that he was walking into enemy territory. Royce Harlan's influence permeated this town like smoke from a distant fire, invisible, but undeniably present. The store was dim and crowded with merchandise, bolts of cloth stacked beside barrels of flour, tools hanging from wooden pegs, and patent medicines lined up on shelves like colored glass soldiers. Henry Morrison, the store's owner, looked up from his ledger as Jasper entered, his weathered face creasing into a cautious smile. "Jasper Calloway," Morrison said, his voice carrying the forced heartiness of a man who owed money to dangerous people. "Don't see you in town very often. What brings you to civilization?" "Need some supplies," Jasper replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Cloth, mostly. Some baby things." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of baby items, but he made no comment. Instead, he gestured toward a corner where bolts of cotton and wool were stacked against the wall. "Help yourself. Got some good quality calico that came in last week, and some flannel that would make fine baby clothes." As Jasper examined the cloth, running the soft fabric between his fingers, he became aware of other customers moving through the store. Two men in dusty trail clothes studied him with unconcealed interest while pretending to examine a display of saddles. Their clothes marked them as riders, and the way they wore their guns suggested they were comfortable using them. "You know," Morrison said conversationally as he measured out yards of blue calico, "there's been some excitement in town lately. Woman went missing, along with her baby. Husband's brother is worried sick about them." Jasper kept his expression carefully neutral. "That's so." "Yes, indeed. Poor woman lost her mind after her husband died. According to Royce Harland, that's the brother-in-law. He's been organizing search parties, offering a substantial reward for information leading to their safe return." Morrison's voice carried the practiced cadence of a man repeating a story he had been told to spread. "Folks are saying she might be dangerous to herself and the child." "Dangerous how?" Jasper asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Grief does strange things to people," Morrison replied with a meaningful look. "Makes them see threats where none exist, run from help when they need it most. Royce says she attacked him when he tried to talk sense into her, then disappeared in the night with the baby. He's beside himself with worry." The careful way Morrison told the story, hitting all the right notes of concern and sympathy, made it clear that this version of events had been crafted by someone who understood how to manipulate public opinion. By painting Clara as mentally unstable and potentially dangerous, Royce had given himself moral authority to hunt her down while appearing to be the concerned family member trying to protect a woman from her own delusions. "Sounds like a difficult situation," Jasper said, accepting the wrapped bundle of cloth from Morrison. "I hope they find her safe." "Oh, they will," Morrison assured him with a confidence that made Jasper's blood run cold. "Royce has men out looking for her right now. Good men, experienced trackers. It's only a matter of time." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the store's front door opened with a jangle of brass bells, and Royce Harland himself stepped inside. Jasper recognized him immediately, though they had never been formally introduced. Everything about the man spoke of power and control, from his expensive clothes to the confident way he moved through the store as if he owned it, which, Jasper realized, he probably did. Harland was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He was not a large man physically, but he carried himself with the assurance of someone who was accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. The two gunmen who had been watching Jasper immediately straightened to attention, confirming what Jasper had already suspected about their employment. "Henry," Harland said to Morrison, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man. "I trust business is going well?" "Very well, Mr. Harland. Thank you for asking." Morrison's deference was so complete it was almost painful to witness. "I was just telling Mr. Calloway here about the search for your poor sister-in-law." Harlan's pale eyes fixed on Jasper with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. "Mr. Calloway. I don't believe we've been introduced. Royce Harland." He extended a soft hand that had never known hard labor. "Jasper Calloway," Jasper replied, accepting the handshake and noting the way Harlan's grip lingered a moment too long, as if testing his strength. "You have a ranch south of here, if I'm not mistaken," Harlan said, his tone conversational but his eyes calculating. "Rather isolated location. Beautiful country, though very private." The emphasis on the last word was slight but unmistakable. Harlan was letting him know that his movements were being watched, that his property had been noted and catalogued as a potential hiding place. It was a subtle threat wrapped in the language of polite conversation. "I like the solitude," Jasper replied evenly. "Man can think clearly when he's not surrounded by noise and commotion." "Indeed, though I imagine it gets lonely out there, especially for a bachelor." Harlan's smile was cold and predatory. "Have you seen anything unusual lately? Any strangers passing through? I'm particularly concerned about a young woman traveling with an infant. She's unwell, and I fear for her safety." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, both men understanding exactly what was being asked and what was being threatened. Jasper could feel the weight of the two gunmen's attention, could sense Morrison's nervous energy as the storekeeper waited to see how this confrontation would play out. "Can't say I have," Jasper said finally. "Like I said, it's quiet out my way. If I see anything unusual, I'll be sure to let you know." "I would appreciate that very much," Harlan replied, his smile never wavering. "You see, Clara, that's her name. Clara, she's been through a terrible trauma. Losing her husband so suddenly, being left with debts and a new baby, it's affected her judgment. She's convinced herself that people are trying to harm her and the child, when in fact we only want to help." "Tragic situation," Jasper said, his voice carefully neutral. "It is indeed. But I'm confident we'll locate her soon. I have men searching every farm, every cabin, every possible hiding place within a 50-mile radius. Sooner or later, she'll surface. And when she does, we'll be there to bring her home safely." Harlan's eyes never left Jasper's face as he spoke, watching for any flicker of recognition or guilt. "Well," Jasper said, gathering up his purchases, "I hope she gets the help she needs." "Oh, she will," Harlan assured him. "I'll make certain of that." Jasper left the store with Harlan's pale eyes boring into his back, knowing that he had just been given a final warning. The message had been clear enough. Royce Harlan knew or suspected that Clara was hiding somewhere in the area, and he was prepared to tear apart every building and question every person until he found her. The pretense of concern for her welfare was just that, a pretense that would be discarded the moment it was no longer useful. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than usual, every shadow potentially concealing watchers, every distant dust cloud a possible search party. Jasper kept Buck at a steady pace, fighting the urge to hurry. Rushing would only draw attention, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that he was already being watched more closely than he cared to be. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled in its sheltered valley with smoke rising peacefully from the chimney, Jasper felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. As he dismounted and began to unsaddle Buck, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, clearly visible in the soft earth near the front door, were the hoof prints of at least 3 horses. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the morning while he had been in town. Someone had been here, had ridden right up to his door, and had undoubtedly seen evidence of his unexpected guests. Jasper's hand moved instinctively to his revolver as he approached the cabin. The door stood slightly ajar, which was not how he had left it. From inside came the sound of voices, Clara's voice, speaking in low, urgent tones, and deeper voices responding with the casual arrogance of men who were accustomed to intimidating women. Taking a deep breath, Jasper pushed open the door and stepped inside, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. What he saw made his jaw clench with controlled anger. 3 men sat around his table as if they owned the place, their muddy boots propped up on his chairs, their hats tilted back at insolent angles. Clara stood near the fireplace, holding baby Sarah protectively against her chest, her face pale but determined. The men were clearly Harlan's employees, hard-faced individuals who wore their guns like badges of authority. "Afternoon, boys," Jasper said mildly, though his eyes were cold as winter stone. "Something I can help you with?" The largest of the 3 men, a bearded giant with scars on his knuckles, grinned unpleasantly. "Just having a friendly chat with the lady here, Calloway. She's been telling us how she came to be in your cabin." "And what story did she tell you?" Jasper asked, moving slowly into the room but keeping his hand near his weapon. "Oh, says she's your cousin from back east," the second man said with a sneer. "Came out here with her baby to help keep house for you. Real touching family reunion." The third man, older and meaner looking than his companions, spat tobacco juice into Jasper's fireplace. "Course, we're thinking maybe she's telling us a different kind of story. Maybe one that Mr. Harlan would find real interesting." Jasper looked at Clara, noting the defiant set of her chin despite the fear in her eyes. She had done her best to protect them both, but it was clear that these men suspected the truth. The only question now was whether they intended to take her with them immediately or simply report back to Harlan with what they had found. "Well," Jasper said conversationally, "I appreciate you boys stopping by to check on my family, but as you can see, everything's fine here, so I reckon you can be on your way." The bearded man laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Don't think so, Calloway. See, Mr. Harlan is real particular about making sure missing ladies get proper care. Thinks maybe your cousin here might need some professional attention." "The kind of attention you get from a doctor?" Jasper asked. "The kind you get from Mr. Harlan himself," the man replied, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. "He's real good at helping confused ladies remember where they belong." The threat was clear enough, and Jasper knew that the moment of decision had arrived. These men intended to take Clara and the baby, and they clearly believed that 3 guns gave them sufficient advantage to do so without opposition. They had underestimated both Jasper's skill and his determination. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," Jasper said quietly. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of baby Sarah's breathing. The 3 gunmen exchanged glances, clearly surprised by Jasper's calm refusal to be intimidated. They had expected him to back down when faced with superior numbers, to let them take what they came for rather than risk his life for a woman who was not even related to him. "You sure about that, Calloway?" the bearded man asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. 3 against 1 ain't real good odds, even for a man with your reputation." So they knew about him, knew about his past and his abilities with a gun. That knowledge would make them more cautious, but it would not make them back down. Men like these had survived by being willing to use violence when words failed, and Jasper could see in their eyes that they were already calculating angles and drawing distances. "Maybe not," Jasper agreed, "but then again, I'm not asking you to leave because I'm afraid of you. I'm asking because it's the polite thing to do." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara pressed herself back against the wall, clutching Sarah tightly, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the confrontation unfold. She understood, as Jasper did, that the next few moments would determine not just their immediate fate, but whether she and her daughter would ever be free of Royce Harlan's influence. "Last chance, Calloway," the bearded man said, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Step aside and let us take the lady where she belongs, or things are going to get unpleasant real quick." Jasper's response was delivered in the same mild tone he might have used to comment on the weather. "I reckon they already are unpleasant. Question is, how unpleasant do you want them to get?" The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Jasper could see the calculations running behind the bearded man's eyes, 3 guns against 1, but in the confined space of the cabin, numbers might not matter as much as speed and accuracy. The older gunman shifted slightly in his chair, angling for a better draw, while the third man's hand crept toward his weapon with the careful deliberation of a man who had done this before. It was Clara who broke the deadlock, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "If you take one step toward my daughter," she said, her words quiet but carrying the absolute conviction of a mother's fury, "I will make sure Royce Harlan learns exactly what kind of men he employs to terrorize women and children." The bearded man laughed, but there was less confidence in the sound than before. "Lady, you ain't in no position to be making threats. Aren't I?" Clara's green eyes blazed with defiance. "I may be trapped here, but I'm not stupid. I know who you are. Jake Morrison, yes, I know your name. And yours too, Pete Dawson. You think Royce would be pleased to know that his men threatened to harm an innocent baby? That you came into a man's home uninvited and tried to take a woman by force?" The use of their names clearly shook the gunman more than Jasper's quiet refusal had. In a small community like Cedar Flats, reputation mattered, and even men who lived by violence had to maintain a certain facade of respectability. Clara was reminding them that their actions here would not remain secret, that there would be consequences beyond the immediate confrontation. "Now you listen here," Jake Morrison began, but Clara cut him off. "No, you listen. I may be a widow with no family to protect me, but I'm not some desperate creature who can be intimidated into silence. If you force me to go back to Royce, if you harm this child or this man who offered us shelter, I will find a way to make my story known. The territorial marshal may only come through twice a year, but when he does, he'll hear every detail of what happened here." Jasper watched the 3 men exchange uncertain glances. Clara had found their weakness, the knowledge that their actions, however justified they might seem in the moment, would not hold up to outside scrutiny. Even in the lawless territories, there were lines that could not be crossed without consequences, and threatening an infant crossed all of them. The older gunman, Pete Dawson, spat again into the fireplace and stood slowly. "This ain't over, Calloway, and Mr. Harlan knows the lady is here and he ain't going to just forget about it. Mr. Harlan can come speak to me himself if he has something to say," Jasper replied evenly. "I don't conduct business through intermediaries." Jake Morrison's face darkened with anger. "You think you're real smart, don't you? But you can't watch her every minute of every day. Sooner or later, you'll make a mistake. And when you do, when I do, you'll be there to take advantage of it." Jasper finished. "I understand. But until then, I suggest you get off my property before I decide you're trespassing with ill intent." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. In the territories, a man's right to defend his property was absolute, and shooting trespassers was not only legal but expected. The 3 gunmen understood this as well as Jasper did, and they also understood that in a straight fight, their numbers might not be enough to overcome his superior skill and knowledge of the terrain. With grudging reluctance, the 3 men filed out of the cabin, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Jake Morrison paused at the threshold, his scarred face twisted with malice. "This ain't over," he repeated. "Not by a long shot." "I didn't figure it was," Jasper replied calmly, after the men had mounted their horses and ridden away. Jasper barred the door and moved to the window, watching until the dust of their passage disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he turn back to Clara, who had sunk into a chair with baby Sarah still clutched protectively in her arms. "That was well done," he said quietly. "Using their names like that, reminding them that their actions have consequences, it bought us time." Clara's hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Not much time. Royce will know where I am now, and he'll come himself next time. He won't make the mistake of sending men who can be shamed into backing down." Jasper nodded grimly. The confrontation had been won, but the victory was temporary at best. Royce Harlan now knew exactly where to find Clara, and he would not make the same tactical error twice. When he came, and he would come, it would be with overwhelming force and no intention of being turned away by words alone. "We need to prepare," Jasper said, moving to check his weapons. "He'll give us a day or two to think about what happened here. Let the fear build up. Then he'll come with enough men to make resistance seem impossible." "Maybe I should just go," Clara said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take Sarah and leave tonight. Try to make it to Colorado on foot. At least then you wouldn't be in danger because of us." Jasper turned to face her, seeing the desperation in her eyes, the terrible calculation of a mother trying to weigh impossible choices. "You wouldn't make it 10 miles. Not with a baby. Not with Harlan's men watching every trail. And even if you did somehow reach your sister, what's to stop him from following you there? From making the same claims about legal ownership in a different territory?" Clara's shoulders sagged as the truth of his words sank in. Running had always been a desperate measure, a way to buy time rather than solve the fundamental problem. As long as Royce Harlan lived and had power, she and Sarah would never be truly safe. The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Jasper cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin, checked his ammunition supplies, and made sure Clara knew how to use the shotgun he kept above the mantel. She proved to be a quick learner, handling the weapon with the grim determination of someone who understood that her child's life might depend on her ability to use it. As evening approached, they heard the sound of a single horse approaching at a careful walk. Jasper positioned himself at the window with his rifle while Clara moved to the back of the cabin with the baby and the shotgun. But the rider who appeared was not one of Harlan's gunmen. Instead, it was an elderly woman mounted on a sturdy gray mare, her weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades spent under the prairie sun. She wore a simple black dress and bonnet, and her posture in the saddle suggested someone who had been riding horses since childhood. More importantly, her hands were empty of weapons. And she approached the cabin with the careful deliberation of someone seeking parley rather than conflict. Jasper recognized her as Maeve O'Sullivan, a widow who lived alone on a small homestead about 15 miles north of Cedar Flats. She was known throughout the territory as a woman of fierce independence and unwavering moral conviction, someone who spoke her mind regardless of the consequences and had little patience for bullies or cowards. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Jasper called through the door. "What brings you out this way so late in the day?" "Open the door. Jasper Calloway," came the sharp reply. "I've got things to say that shouldn't be shouted across the prairie for all to hear." Jasper unbarred the door and stepped aside to let the old woman enter. Maeve O'Sullivan was perhaps 70 years old, but she moved with the energy of someone half her age. Her pale blue eyes took in the scene, Clara holding the baby, the weapons arranged within easy reach, the general atmosphere of preparation for siege, and she nodded with grim satisfaction. And so it's true then, she said without preamble. You're sheltering Thomas McKenna's widow and child from that snake Royce Harland. Clara started at the mention of her late husband's name. But Maeve's attention had already shifted to her with a look of maternal concern mixed with steely determination. A child, I knew your husband's family back in Missouri before they came west. Thomas was a good man with poor judgment in business matters, but he never deserved what befell him. And you certainly don't deserve what Royce Harland has planned for you. You know about the contract? Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Maeve snorted with disdain. Contract. My foot. I was there when Thomas signed those papers, though I didn't know what they were at the time. Royce got him liquored up at Murphy's saloon, filled his head with promises about a big cattle deal that would solve all his problems. Poor boy was so desperate he would have signed away his soul if Royce had asked for it. Were you one of the witnesses? Jasper asked. Lord, no. I wouldn't put my name to any document that snake was involved with. The witnesses were Murphy himself and that clerk of his. Both of them so deep in Royce's pocket they can't see daylight. Maeve's voice carried the disgust of someone who had watched good people destroyed by greed and corruption. But I was sitting close enough to hear what was said, and I can tell you that contract won't hold water in any honest court. Clara looked up with the first spark of hope Jasper had seen in her eyes since he found her in the hollow tree. Are you certain? A child. I may be old, but I'm not ignorant. My late husband was a lawyer before we came west, and he taught me plenty about legal matters. A contract signed by a man too drunk to understand what he was agreeing to, witnessed by parties with financial interest in the outcome, and involving terms that violate basic human dignity. No judge worth his salt would enforce such a thing. But here in Cedar Flats, Clara began. Here in Cedar Flats there is no judge, Maeve interrupted. Only Sheriff Morrison, who owes Royce money, and a handful of businessmen who are too afraid of him to speak up. But that doesn't make Royce's claims legal, and it doesn't give him the right to hunt you down like an animal. Jasper felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, hope mixed with the possibility of justice actually prevailing. What are you suggesting, Mrs. O'Sullivan? The old woman's eyes glittered with a fierce light that reminded Jasper of Clara's own determination. I'm suggesting that it's time someone stood up to Royce Harland. Time someone reminded him that he's not the only person in this territory with influence and connections. You're talking about fighting him, Clara said. But he has so many men, so much power. A power built on fear and debt, Maeve interrupted. Take away the fear. Prove that he can be opposed successfully, and you'd be surprised how quickly that power crumbles. There are plenty of people in Cedar Flats and the surrounding area who are tired of Royce's bullying, but they need someone to rally behind, someone to show them that resistance is possible. Jasper studied the old woman's face, seeing the resolution there, the willingness to put herself at risk for the sake of justice. What exactly are you proposing? Maeve O'Sullivan smiled, and for a moment her weathered features took on an almost predatory aspect. I'm proposing that we give Royce Harland a fight he's not expecting, one that takes place in the court of public opinion rather than at gunpoint. You see, I've been keeping detailed records of his business practices for years, waiting for the right moment to use them. Financial irregularities, intimidation tactics, illegal contracts. I've documented it all. But who would you take such evidence to? Clara asked. Everyone here is afraid of him. Not everyone, child. The territorial marshal may only visit twice a year, but when he does, he has absolute authority. And it so happens that Marshal Davies is due for his next circuit in 3 weeks. If we can keep you safe until then, if we can gather enough evidence and enough witnesses willing to speak out, The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. It was a dangerous plan, one that would require careful coordination and considerable courage from people who had grown accustomed to looking the other way when Royce Harlan committed his crimes. But it was also the first real chance Clara had been offered to fight back against her tormentor rather than simply running from him. 3 weeks, Jasper said thoughtfully. That's a long time to hold out against determined opposition. It is, Maeve agreed. But I don't think you'll be holding out alone. Word is already spreading about what happened here today, about how Royce's men backed down rather than face an honest fight. There are other ranchers in this area, other settlers who are tired of being afraid. Some of them might be willing to help, if they thought there was a real chance of success. Clara looked down at baby Sarah, who slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the adult concerns swirling around her. And if we fail? If Royce proves too strong, or if people are too afraid to stand up to him? Maeve's expression softened with maternal compassion. Then at least you'll have tried, child. At least you'll have fought for your freedom instead of simply accepting whatever fate others chose for you. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, stand up and fight, regardless of the odds. The old woman's words resonated in the cabin's gathering darkness, mixing with the sound of wind in the eaves and the distant call of a coyote somewhere on the prairie. Outside, storm clouds were building again, promising another night of rain and concealment. But inside the cabin, for the first time since Jasper had found Clara in the hollow tree, there was something that might almost be called hope. In 3 weeks, Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. I can be strong for 3 weeks. For Sarah, I can be strong for as long as it takes. Jasper met her eyes across the lamplight, seeing in them a reflection of his own determination. Then we'd better start planning. The rain that had threatened all evening finally arrived near midnight, drumming against the cabin's roof with the steady persistence of nature asserting its dominance over the affairs of men. Jasper sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the storm turn the prairie into a dark sea broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. Behind him, Clara moved quietly about the cabin, settling baby Sarah for the night and checking the positions of the weapons they had placed throughout the room. Maeve O'Sullivan had departed just before the storm broke, riding her sturdy mare back toward her own homestead with promises to return within a few days. She would use that time, she had told them, to sound out potential allies among the scattered ranchers and homesteaders who had grown weary of Royce Harlan's influence. It was dangerous work for a woman of her age, but Maeve had faced down claim jumpers, hostile weather, and prairie fires during her decades on the frontier. She was not easily intimidated. Do you think she's right? Clara asked softly, settling into the chair beside Jasper. About people being willing to stand up to Royce if they thought they had a chance? Jasper considered the question carefully. He had lived in this territory long enough to understand its people, their fierce independence balanced against their practical recognition of when discretion was the better part of valor. Most of them had come west to escape something or someone, seeking the kind of freedom that could only be found in open country where a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work hard and deal honestly with his neighbors. Maybe, he said finally. Fear is a powerful thing, but so is anger when it's given the right outlet. Royce has been building resentment for years with his strong-arm tactics and corrupt dealings. If people believed there was a real chance of bringing him down, they might find their courage. Clara finished. But 3 weeks is a long time, and Royce won't sit idle while we try to organize opposition against him. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses cut through the steady drumbeat of rain. Jasper tensed, bringing his rifle to ready position. But the riders passed by the cabin without stopping, their hoofbeats fading into the storm-swept darkness. Search parties, most likely, or perhaps just men seeking shelter from the weather. Either way, their presence served as a reminder that they were far from safe. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the storm having washed the air clean and left the prairie grass gleaming with moisture. Jasper ventured out early to check on his cattle and survey the surrounding area, leaving Clara with strict instructions to keep the door barred and the shotgun within reach. He found no immediate signs of watchers, but the feeling of being observed followed him throughout his morning rounds. It was on his return that he spotted them, 3 riders approaching from the east, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who believed themselves to be in complete control of the situation. These were not the same gunmen who had visited the day before, but Jasper recognized the type: hardened men who lived by violence and intimidation, hired muscle brought in from outside the territory to handle problems that required more finesse than local talent could provide. Jasper spurred Buck toward the cabin, arriving just as the 3 riders crested the low hill that overlooked his property. He dismounted quickly and entered the cabin, finding Clara already at the window with the baby in one arm and the shotgun in the other. "More of Royce's men?" she asked, though the answer was obvious from her expression. "Different ones this time," Jasper replied, checking his weapons. "Professional gun hands by the look of them. Royce is escalating." The 3 riders approached slowly, giving Jasper and Clara ample time to observe them. The leader was a tall, lean man with silver hair and the kind of pale scars that spoke of knife fights survived. His companions were younger but equally dangerous looking, their clothes and equipment marking them as men who traveled light and struck hard. They stopped just outside the range of accurate rifle fire and sat their horses in silence for several minutes, studying the cabin and its defenses. It was a calculated display of patience and control, designed to build tension and demonstrate that they were in no hurry to resolve the situation through violence. Finally, the silver-haired leader called out in a voice that carried easily across the intervening distance. "Calloway, we need to talk." Jasper stepped onto the cabin's small porch, his rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. "I'm listening." "My name is Wade Garrett. Mr. Harlan sent me to discuss a business proposition with you." The name meant nothing to Jasper, but Clara's sharp intake of breath told him she recognized it. "Who is he?" Jasper asked without taking his eyes off the riders. "A hired killer," Clara whispered. "Royce used him before, when a rancher named Patterson refused to sell his land. Patterson's barn burned down, his cattle were poisoned, and finally Patterson himself was found shot in what the sheriff called a hunting accident." The escalation was clear. Royce had moved beyond simple intimidation to employing men whose specialty was making problems disappear permanently. It was a sign of both his desperation and his determination to resolve the situation before word of his actions could spread beyond the local area. "What kind of proposition?" Jasper called back, playing for time while his mind raced through possible responses. "The kind that's best discussed face to face," Garrett replied. "You have something that belongs to Mr. Harland, and he's prepared to be generous in exchange for its return. Nothing here belongs to Royce Harland." Clara's voice rang out clear and strong, surprising both Jasper and the 3 riders. She had stepped onto the porch beside him, still holding baby Sarah but with her chin raised in defiance. Garrett's laughter was cold and without humor. "Mrs. McKenna, how nice to hear your voice. Mr. Harland has been so worried about you and the child." "Has he?" Clara's tone was sharp with sarcasm. "Worried enough to send killers to ensure our safe return? Now, that's harsh language for a man who's only trying to help a confused widow." Garrett replied, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Mr. Harland is concerned about your mental state, Mrs. McKenna. He thinks the strain of recent events has affected your judgment." My judgment is perfectly clear, Clara shot back. Clear enough to recognize hired murderers when I see them. Jasper felt a surge of admiration for Clara's courage, even as he worried about the wisdom of provoking armed men. But he was beginning to understand that this confrontation was about more than just their immediate safety. It was about Clara reclaiming her voice, her right to determine her own fate and that of her child. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, Garrett called out, his patience clearly wearing thin. Mr. Harland is prepared to be reasonable. He's willing to overlook certain irregularities in exchange for a peaceful resolution. What irregularities? Jasper asked, genuinely curious about what Royce might be offering. Well, there's the matter of theft, for one thing, Garrett replied. Mrs. and McKenna left Cedar Flats with items that didn't belong to her, jewelry, money, personal effects that were part of her late husband's estate. Mr. Harland, as the legal administrator of that estate, is prepared not to press charges if she returns voluntarily. It was a masterful bit of manipulation, Jasper realized. By accusing Clara of theft, Royce was creating legal justification for hunting her down while simultaneously offering her a way to avoid prosecution. The fact that the charges were almost certainly fabricated mattered less than their surface plausibility. I took nothing that wasn't mine, Clara declared, her voice shaking with indignation. The few pieces of jewelry I have were gifts from my mother. The money was from my own savings. That's not how Mr. Harland sees it, Garrett replied smoothly. But he's a reasonable man, willing to let bygones be bygones if you come back peacefully. Of course, there would need to be certain guarantees about your future behavior. The euphemisms were wearing thin, and the true nature of Royce's proposition was becoming clear. Clara would be expected to submit to whatever treatment he deemed appropriate, and any resistance would be met with accusations of criminal behavior or mental instability. It was a trap with no honorable escape, designed to give Royce legal cover for whatever actions he chose to take. And if she refuses? Jasper asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Garrett's smile was visible even at this distance, cold and predatory. Well, that would be unfortunate. A woman alone with a baby, no family to protect her, no legal standing to resist the legitimate claims against her husband's estate. Accidents happen, Calloway. People disappear. Sometimes they're never found. The threat was delivered with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, but its implications were unmistakable. If Clara would not come voluntarily, she would be taken by force. If she continued to resist, she would simply vanish, becoming another victim of the harsh frontier where violence was common and justice was often a matter of personal interpretation. You seem to be under a misapprehension, Clara said suddenly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even Jasper. You think I'm some helpless widow who can be frightened into submission with threats and legal manipulations? Aren't you? Garrett asked, his tone mocking. No, Clara replied firmly. I'm a woman who has already lost everything that mattered to her except her child. Do you understand what that means, Mr. Garrett? It means I have nothing left to lose except Sarah's life and freedom. And I will die before I let Royce Harland take those from me. The declaration hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, carrying with it the absolute conviction of someone who had reached the end of compromise and negotiation. Jasper could see the surprise on the faces of the three riders, their expectation of easy intimidation replaced by the recognition that they were dealing with someone who could not be broken by conventional threats. That's very moving, Garrett said after a moment, his voice hardening. But dead heroes don't raise children, Mrs. McKenna, and that baby needs her mother alive, even if it means accepting certain unpleasant realities. The only unpleasant reality here, Clara replied, is that men like you and Royce Harland exist in the world. But I've discovered something in the past few days, something I never knew about myself. And what's that? Garrett asked, though his attention was clearly shifting to Jasper, assessing the threat he represented. I've discovered that I would rather die fighting for my freedom than live as anyone's property, Clara said. And I've discovered that there are still good people in this world. People willing to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous. She looked at Jasper as she spoke, and he saw in her eyes not just gratitude, but something deeper, a recognition of shared values and mutual respect that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. It was a look that spoke of possibilities, of a future that might be built together if they could survive the immediate challenges. Touching, Garrett said dryly. But sentiment doesn't stop bullets, and righteousness doesn't feed babies. Last chance, Mrs. McKenna, come with us now, and Mr. Harland will be merciful. Continue this foolishness, and the consequences will be on your head. Clara's response was to step closer to Jasper, her free hand moving to rest on his arm in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. My answer is no. Mr. Garrett, today, tomorrow, and every day after that, no. The three riders sat in silence for a long moment. The tension stretched thin between the two groups. Finally, Garrett touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been politeness but carried the weight of a promise. So be it, he said, but don't say you weren't given a chance to resolve this peacefully. With that, the three men wheeled their horses and rode away, not hurrying but making it clear that they would not be returning with offers of negotiation. The next time they came, it would be with the intention of taking what they wanted by force. Jasper and Clara stood on the porch until the riders disappeared over the horizon, neither speaking but both understanding that they had just crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The war for Clara's freedom had moved beyond words and threats to the realm where actions would determine the outcome. I meant what I said, Clara said quietly as they turned to go back inside. About preferring to die fighting rather than live as property. I know, Jasper replied, and I meant what I didn't say, that you won't have to face that choice alone. Their eyes met in the doorway of the cabin, and something passed between them that was deeper than shared danger or mutual attraction. It was the recognition of two people who had found in each other the courage to stand against impossible odds, who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. As they prepared for whatever was to come, Jasper found himself thinking that perhaps Maeve O'Sullivan had been right about more than just the possibility of organizing resistance against Royce Harland. Perhaps she had also been right about the power of hope to transform fear into determination and isolation into strength. But those were thoughts for later. Right now, they had a war to fight. The dawn came with an unnatural stillness that set Jasper's nerves on edge. No wind stirred the prairie grass, no birds called from the scattered cottonwoods, and even the usual sounds of his cattle moving to water seemed muted and distant. It was the kind of quiet that preceded violent storms or dangerous confrontations, as if the very earth was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Jasper had been awake since before first light, positioned at the window with his rifle, watching for any sign of movement across the rolling landscape. Clara sat at the table behind him, nursing baby Sarah while keeping the shotgun within easy reach. They had spoken little during the long night, both understanding that words were inadequate preparation for what they might face with the rising sun. "He's coming today," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. It was not a question but a statement of certainty born from days of mounting tension and the unmistakable signs that Royce Harland's patience had finally reached its end. I know, Jasper replied, never taking his eyes from the horizon. The question is how many men he'll bring and whether he'll try to take you alive or simply finish this permanently. The thought hung between them like smoke from a cold fire. Both of them understood that Royce had moved beyond caring about legal niceties or public opinion. Wade Garrett's visit the previous day had been a final formality, a last opportunity for surrender before the situation escalated to its inevitable conclusion. Now it was simply a matter of force against force, with Clara's life and freedom as the prize. "Jasper," Clara said, her voice carrying a note he had not heard before, something deeper than gratitude or even affection. "Before this happens, before whatever comes next, I need you to know something." He turned from the window to look at her, struck by the quiet dignity in her posture despite everything she had endured. Baby Sarah slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them, trusting completely in her mother's ability to protect her. The sight stirred something in Jasper's chest that he had thought long buried beneath years of solitude and self-reliance. "What is it?" he asked gently. "These past days, staying here with you, watching how you've chosen to stand with us against impossible odds. It's shown me something I thought I'd never find again." Clara's green eyes were steady on his face, unflinching in their honesty. "I thought Thomas had broken something in me with his weakness and his debts, that I would never again be able to trust a man's character. But you've proven me wrong." Jasper felt his throat tighten with emotion he was unaccustomed to expressing. "Clara, let me finish," she said softly. "If we survive this day, if somehow we find a way through what's coming, I want you to know that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude for your protection. It's respect for your courage, admiration for your principles, and—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "And something deeper that I'm only beginning to understand myself." The words settled between them like seeds planted in fertile ground, carrying the promise of something that might grow into beauty if given the chance to flourish. Jasper crossed the small distance that separated them and knelt beside her chair, covering her free hand with his own weathered fingers. "I feel it too," he said simply. "Whatever it is, whatever it might become, I feel it too. And that's why I need you to promise me something." "Ooh, what?" "If this goes badly, if Royce overwhelms our defenses, you take Sarah and run for the back country. There's a trail that leads north through the breaks toward Maeve O'Sullivan's place. You follow it for about 5 miles until you reach a line shack I use during roundup. There's supplies there, enough to last until you can get word to the territorial marshal." Clara shook her head firmly. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "You will if it means saving your daughter," Jasper replied with equal firmness. "That baby is the future. Clara, whatever happens to us, she deserves the chance to grow up free." Before Clara could respond, a sound from outside drew Jasper's attention back to the window. A single rider was approaching from the east, moving at an easy lope that suggested confidence rather than urgency. As the figure drew closer, Jasper recognized the silver hair and lean frame of Wade Garrett, though this time the gunman rode alone. "It's Garrett," Jasper said, checking his rifle. "Just him, no backup visible." Clara joined him at the window, baby Sarah stirring restlessly in her arms as if sensing the tension that filled the cabin. Why would he come alone? It's not like him to take unnecessary risks. Jasper studied the approaching rider, noting the casual way Garrett sat his horse and the fact that his hands were nowhere near his weapons. "He's not here to fight. He's here to deliver a message." Garrett reined his horse to a stop just outside rifle range and called out in his clear, carrying voice. "Calloway, Mrs. McKenna, I come under a flag of truce." "Say your piece," Jasper shouted back, his rifle trained on the gunman's chest. Mr. Harlan wants you to know he's a reasonable man, Garrett replied. He's prepared to make one final offer before this situation becomes unpleasant for everyone involved. We've heard his offers, Clara called out, stepping into view beside Jasper. The answer remains no. Garrett's laughter drifted across the morning air like the call of a hunting hawk. Mrs. McKenna, you haven't heard this offer yet. Mr. Harlan is prepared to forget about the debts. Forget about the legal complications. Forget about everything. If you'll simply come with me now and sign a document relinquishing all claims to your late husband's estate. Including my daughter? Clara asked, though her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. The child would remain with Mr. Harlan as a ward of the estate. Garrett replied smoothly. She'd be well cared for, educated properly, given every advantage. You'd be free to go wherever you pleased, start a new life without the burden of raising a child alone in harsh country. The offer was diabolic in its calculated cruelty, designed to force Clara to choose between her own freedom and her daughter's welfare. Royce understood that no mother would willingly abandon her child, but he was counting on Clara's desperation and fear to overcome her maternal instincts. And if I refuse? Clara asked, though her voice suggested she was asking purely for form's sake. Then Mr. Harlan will be forced to take more direct action. Garrett replied. He'll be here within the hour with enough men to settle this matter permanently. Your choice is simple. Walk away now with your life, or stay and watch everyone you care about suffer for your stubbornness. The ultimatum hung in the air like the scent of distant smoke, carrying with it the promise of violence and destruction. Jasper could see Clara weighing the impossible choice, her love for her daughter warring with her knowledge of what kind of life Sarah would have under Royce Harlan's control. How do I know he'll keep his word? Clara asked finally. How do I know he won't simply take Sarah anyway once I've signed his papers? You don't, Garrett admitted with brutal honesty. But you know what will happen if you refuse. Your friend Calloway here is good with a gun, but he's not good enough to fight off a dozen determined men. The baby will be orphaned, you'll be dead, and Mr. Harlan will get what he wants anyway. At least this way, the child lives. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, using Clara's love for her daughter as a weapon against her. Jasper could see the effect it was having, the way her shoulders sagged as the weight of impossible choices pressed down upon her. This was exactly the kind of dilemma that Royce Harlan excelled at creating, situations where every option led to pain and loss. Take your offer back to Royce, Clara said suddenly, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even Jasper. Tell him that Sarah McKenna will grow up free or not at all. Tell him that some things are more important than survival, and that he will never understand what those things are because he has no soul. Garrett's expression hardened at the rejection of what he clearly considered a generous offer. You're condemning that child to death along with yourself. No, Clara replied firmly. I'm giving her the chance to live as a human being rather than as property. That's a gift worth any price. The gunman sat in silence for a long moment, studying the woman who had just rejected his employer's final attempt at negotiation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. So be it. Mrs. McKenna, you can't say you weren't given every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. With that, Garrett wheeled his horse and rode away, not hurrying but moving with the purposeful gait of a man who had important work to do. Jasper watched until he disappeared over the horizon, then turned back to Clara, who stood pale but resolute beside the window. He'll be back within the hour, Jasper said quietly. With enough men to make resistance seem hopeless. I know. Clara moved to place baby Sarah in the makeshift cradle Jasper had constructed from wooden crates and soft blankets. The child fussed briefly but then settled into peaceful sleep, unaware that her young life hung in the balance of adult decisions and conflicting loyalties. "There's still time to reconsider," Jasper said, though his tone made it clear he hoped she would not. "You could take the trail north, try to reach Maeve's place before Royce arrives." Clara shook her head with quiet determination. "I've spent too much of my life running from problems instead of facing them. Thomas ran from his debts until they destroyed him. I ran from Royce until I ended up hiding in a hollow tree like a wounded animal. I won't run anymore, even if it means fighting a battle we can't win, especially then." Clara moved to where the shotgun rested against the wall, checking its load with the careful precision Jasper had taught her. Some battles are worth fighting regardless of the outcome. Sometimes the fighting itself is more important than the winning. Jasper felt a surge of emotion that was part admiration, part fear, and part something deeper that he was only beginning to recognize. This woman, who had seemed so fragile when he first found her bleeding and desperate in the wilderness, had revealed a core of steel that reminded him why he had chosen to involve himself in her fight. "In that case," he said, moving to his own rifle and checking its action one final time, "we'd better make sure we give them a fight they'll remember," as if summoned by his words. The sound of multiple horses approached from the east, not the careful pace of scouts or negotiators, but the determined advance of men riding to war. Jasper moved to the window and counted the dust clouds, estimating numbers and calculating odds with the practiced eye of someone who had survived more than his share of violent confrontations. 12, maybe 15 riders, he reported grimly. Royce brought enough men to finish this quickly. Clara joined him at the window, her face pale but set with determination. In the distance, they could see the line of horsemen cresting the low hill that overlooked Jasper's property, moving with the inexorable advance of a prairie thunderstorm. At their head rode a figure that could only be Royce Harland himself, finally coming to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "Are you ready?" Jasper asked quietly. Clara looked down at her sleeping daughter, then back at the approaching riders, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and unshakable resolve. "I'm ready." The battle for Clara's freedom was about to begin. The line of riders approached with deliberate slowness, their formation spreading out as they drew closer to the cabin. Jasper could see Royce Harland at their center, a man of average height but commanding presence, his expensive clothes and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Wade Garrett rode at his right hand, while the rest of the men fanned out in a loose semicircle designed to prevent any escape from the cabin. But as the riders drew closer, Jasper noticed something that made his heart race with unexpected hope. These were not all Harland's gunmen. Mixed in with the hard-faced strangers were familiar figures, ranchers and homesteaders from the surrounding area. Men Jasper recognized as neighbors who had chosen to throw their lot in with Royce rather than face his wrath alone. More importantly, approaching from the north came another group of riders, moving fast and purposefully toward the confrontation. At their head rode Maeve O'Sullivan on her sturdy gray mare, her black dress whipping in the wind like a battle flag. Behind her came at least a dozen men that Jasper recognized: Samuel Morrison from the Triple Bar Ranch, old Doc Henley who served the scattered settlements, and others who had apparently decided that enough was enough. Royce Harland noticed the approaching reinforcements at the same moment Jasper did, his confident expression flickering with uncertainty as he realized that his carefully orchestrated show of force was about to become a much more complicated affair. He raised his hand to halt his men, clearly reassessing the situation as the odds shifted in ways he had not anticipated. "Well," Clara said quietly from beside the window, "it appears Maeve was right about people being willing to stand up when they thought they had a chance." The two groups of riders converged in the open ground before Jasper's cabin, creating a tense standoff that crackled with the potential for violence. Royce sat his horse with outward calm, but Jasper could see the calculation in his pale eyes as he weighed his options. He had come here expecting to face only Jasper and Clara, not half the territory's independent ranchers. Maeve O'Sullivan rode forward until she was positioned between the two groups, her aged face set with the kind of moral authority that came from decades of hard-won respect. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the morning air, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Royce Harland," she called out, her tone carrying the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence. "I'm here to inform you that your reign of terror in this territory is at an end." Royce's laugh was forced, lacking the confidence it was meant to project. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm afraid you've been misinformed about the nature of this situation. I'm simply here to collect my brother's widow and child, as is my legal right under the terms of his estate." "Legal right?" Maeve's voice dripped with contempt. "You mean the fraudulent contract you forced a desperate man to sign while he was too drunk to understand what he was agreeing to? The document witnessed by your own employees and designed to give you claim over human beings as if they were livestock." A murmur ran through both groups of riders at this public airing of charges that had previously been whispered only in private. Jasper could see some of Royce's supporters shifting uncomfortably in their saddles, clearly hearing details about their leader's methods that they had not known before. "Those are serious accusations, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Royce replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I hope you can substantiate them." "Oh, I can do better than that," Maeve said with grim satisfaction. "I can present them to Territorial Marshal Davies when he arrives tomorrow, a full day ahead of his scheduled circuit, thanks to an urgent message I sent requesting his immediate attention to criminal activities in this district." The effect of this announcement was electric. Several of Royce's men exchanged nervous glances, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of facing federal law enforcement. The territorial marshal carried absolute authority in matters of territorial law, and his investigations were thorough and impartial. "Tomorrow," Royce's composure finally cracked, revealing the desperation beneath his carefully maintained facade. "That's impossible. Davies isn't due for another 2 weeks." "Times change, Royce," Maeve replied coolly. "Especially when good people finally decide they've had enough of watching evil prosper while they stand by in silence." Wade Garrett leaned close to his employer, speaking in urgent whispers that Jasper could not quite make out. Whatever the gunman was saying, it was clearly not what Royce wanted to hear. His face darkened with anger as he realized that his carefully laid plans were unraveling beyond his ability to control. "This changes nothing," Royce declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Clara McKenna is still bound by legal obligations, and I still have the right to collect what is owed to me." "Actually," came a new voice from the crowd of ranchers, "you don't—" The speaker was Doc Henley, an elderly man whose medical practice had brought him into contact with most of the territory's residents over the years. He urged his horse forward, holding up a leather satchel that he patted meaningfully. "I've been doing some research into the medical records of one Thomas McKenna," Doc continued, his voice carrying the authority of professional expertise. "Specifically, the circumstances of his death and his mental state in the weeks preceding it." Royce's face went pale at this unexpected development. "His medical records are confidential, not when they become evidence in a criminal investigation," Doc interrupted. "And what they show is a man suffering from advanced stages of alcohol poisoning, complicated by pneumonia and severe mental deterioration. In my professional opinion, Thomas McKenna was in no condition to sign legally binding documents during the final month of his life." Another murmur ran through the assembled riders. this one carrying a note of growing indignation as the full scope of Royce's manipulation became clear. Even some of his own supporters were beginning to look at him with disgust and suspicion. Clara stepped out onto the cabin's porch, still holding baby Sarah but no longer hiding behind the walls that had sheltered her. Her appearance drew all eyes, and Jasper was struck by the transformation that had taken place in her over the past days. The frightened, desperate woman he had found in the hollow tree was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet strength and unshakable determination. "I have something to say," Clara announced, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "All of you know me, or know of me. You know that I was married to Thomas McKenna, that I tried to be a good wife to him despite his weaknesses, and that I bore his child in love and hope for the future." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "What you may not know is the extent to which Royce Harlan manipulated and controlled my husband's final months, feeding his addiction and encouraging his gambling in order to increase his debt and dependency. What you may not know is that when Thomas died, Royce used forged and fraudulent documents to claim ownership not just of our property, but of my person and my child. The accusation hit the assembled riders like a physical blow, generating angry mutters and hostile glances directed at Royce. In the frontier territories, there were certain lines that decent people would not cross, and claiming ownership of another human being was chief among them. "Those are lies," Royce snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "Desperate fabrications from a woman whose mind has been affected by grief and isolation." "Are they?" Clara asked quietly. "Then perhaps you'd be willing to submit those documents to examination by Territorial Marshal Davies? Let an impartial legal authority determine their validity?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Jasper could see that Royce was trapped. To refuse would be tantamount to admitting guilt, but to agree would mean exposing documents that would not withstand careful scrutiny. Either way, his position was becoming increasingly untenable. It was then that Wade Garrett made his move, clearly recognizing that the situation had deteriorated beyond salvaging through negotiation or intimidation. His hand dropped to his gun with the fluid motion of a professional killer, but he had underestimated both the alertness of his opponents and the depth of their commitment to seeing justice done. Jasper's rifle spoke first, the sharp crack of the Winchester echoing across the prairie as his bullet took Garrett high in the shoulder, spinning the gunman from his saddle. The shot seemed to release all the pent-up tension of the morning, and suddenly the air was filled with shouts, curses, and the sound of horses wheeling and snorting in confusion. But instead of the general gunfight that everyone expected, something remarkable happened. Most of Royce's supporters, faced with the reality of taking up arms against their neighbors in defense of a man whose true character had just been revealed, simply rode away. They scattered in all directions, unwilling to risk their lives for someone who had proven himself unworthy of their loyalty. Within moments, Royce found himself facing superior numbers with only his most committed gunmen remaining at his side. The mathematical certainty of defeat was written in the grim faces surrounding him, and even his legendary arrogance could not blind him to the reality of his situation. "This isn't over," he snarled, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek where a fragment of stone kicked up by Jasper's bullet had struck him. "I still have legal claims, still have rights under territorial law. Rights you forfeited when you chose to settle disputes with hired killers," Maeve O'Sullivan replied coldly. "Marshal Davies will be very interested in examining those claims, along with your business practices and your methods of debt collection." Faced with the collapse of everything he had built through intimidation and corruption, Royce Harlan made one final desperate play. Spurring his horse forward, he charged directly at the cabin where Clara stood with her baby. clearly intending to seize her by force and use her as leverage to escape the trap that was closing around him. He never reached her. Jasper's second shot took him cleanly from the saddle, the bullet finding its mark with the precision born of years of frontier marksmanship. Royce hit the ground hard and lay still. His reign of terror finally ended by the same violence he had used to build his empire. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Wade Garrett groaning in pain and the distant call of a meadowlark greeting the morning sun. The remaining gunmen, leaderless and outnumbered, surrendered without further resistance, clearly recognizing that their employer's death had left them without either purpose or protection. As the immediate danger passed and the crowd began to disperse, Jasper found himself alone with Clara on the cabin's porch. She stood quietly holding baby Sarah, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the morning sun painted the prairie grass with gold and shadow. "It's over," she said softly, as if she could hardly believe the words. "Yes," Jasper agreed, setting his rifle aside and moving to stand beside her. "It's over." For a long moment they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher into the clear Wyoming sky. Then Clara turned to face him, her green eyes bright with tears of relief and something deeper. "What happens now?" she asked. Jasper reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple silver ring. Nothing fancy or expensive, just a plain band he had purchased years earlier but never found occasion to use. He held it out to her, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. "Now we build something together," he said quietly. "You and me and Sarah, a real home, a real family. If you're willing." Clara's answer was written in her smile, in the way her hand moved to cover his, in the tears of joy that spilled down her cheeks as she nodded her acceptance. "I'm willing. Jasper Calloway. I'm very willing indeed." The wedding took place 3 days later, conducted by Doc Henley in his capacity as a territorial magistrate, with Maeve O'Sullivan and half the county's ranchers as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony held on the cabin's porch, with baby Sarah cooing contentedly in her mother's arms and the vast Wyoming sky serving as their cathedral. Territorial Marshal Davies arrived as promised, conducted his investigation with characteristic thoroughness, and pronounced the matter closed with Royce Harlan's criminal enterprise dismantled and his surviving associates facing federal charges. The fraudulent contracts were declared null and void, and Clara's freedom was established beyond any legal challenge. But the real victory was quieter and more personal than any legal vindication. It was found in the evenings when Jasper and Clara sat together on their porch, watching Sarah take her first steps in the prairie grass. It was discovered in the gradual transformation of a bachelor's rough shelter into a true home, filled with love and laughter and the promise of tomorrow. The frontier was still dangerous, still harsh and unforgiving. But they faced it together now, no longer as isolated individuals struggling against overwhelming odds, but as a family bound by love and strengthened by shared courage. They had found in each other not just safety and companionship, but the kind of deep, enduring partnership that could weather any storm the vast western sky might send their way. And in the end, that was victory enough for anyone.